The impact was brutal. Jack Carter's ship plummeted through the alien sky, trailing smoke like a wounded beast. His hands gripped the controls, muscles tense as alarms screamed in his ears. Gravity yanked him down, faster, harder. The planet's surface rushed toward him, a jagged landscape of crimson rock and twisting black spires. He barely had time to brace before the crash. Metal shrieked as his ship scraped across the terrain, skidding to a violent halt. Silence followed. Then, pain. Jack groaned, his ribs protesting as he unbuckled his harness and forced himself upright. The air was thick, laced with an iron scent, and the sky above churned with storm clouds the color of deep bruises. His ship was totaled. Before he could take another breath, a sound echoed across the wasteland, the heavy, deliberate march of boots on stone. Jack turned, heart pounding. A group of towering figures emerged from the mist. Their armor gleamed dark as obsidian, their eyes burning gold. Draken warriors, 7 feet tall, scales lining their arms, their movements calculated and lethal. And leading them was someone who could only be their queen. She was different, taller, sharper. Midnight black horns curled from her forehead, and her eyes held the weight of a ruler who had never been defied. Her gaze locked onto Jack, analyzing him with cold amusement. The warriors flanked her, hands resting on the hilts of weapons that looked far too eager for use. A voice, smooth but edged with steel, cut through the silence. "You are human." The way she said it, it might as well have been an insult. Jack exhaled, steadying himself. "Yeah, and you are." She ignored the question, stepping closer. "You are weak, small." A flick of her wrist, and one of her warriors unsheathed a blade, pressing the tip against Jack's chest. His heart hammered, but he refused to step back. "I'm tougher than I look." She tilted her head slightly, as if considering his words, then smirked. "That remains to be seen." The blade withdrew, but the tension remained. The warriors chuckled amongst themselves, exchanging glances that spoke of a decision already made. Jack was an outsider, a human. He would not last long here. Then, a guttural roar shook the ground beneath them. Jack's spine stiffened. That sound, deep, primal, came from somewhere beyond the ridge. The Draken warriors barely flinched, their expressions unreadable. But Jack noticed how their hands twitched toward their weapons, how their muscles coiled in readiness. "Something tells me that wasn't the wind," Jack muttered. The Queen's smirk deepened. "That," she said, "was a Ravok." Another roar split the sky, louder this time, closer. The air vibrated with it, sending shivers down Jack's arms. He could feel the power in that sound, raw, untamed. "They say no warrior has ever tamed a Ravok," the Queen continued, her voice deliberately slow. "Even our strongest fall before them. They bow to no one." A flicker of an idea sparked in Jack's mind. He had been in situations like this before, outnumbered, underestimated, and every time, survival had depended on doing the one thing no one expected. He met the Queen's gaze, a slow grin forming. "Then I'll tame one." Silence. And then laughter, deep, echoing, filled with condescension. The warriors shook their heads, some muttering in their own tongue. The Queen's expression remained unreadable, but something flickered in her eyes. Interest, maybe. Amusement, definitely. "You," she mused, "a mere human." Jack crossed his arms. "Unless you're afraid I might actually succeed." The laughter stopped. The warriors stiffened. The Queen's golden eyes narrowed ever so slightly. For a long moment, there was nothing but the wind and the distant growl of something monstrous in the shadows. Then she turned sharply, striding away. "Very well," she called over her shoulder. "If you survive, I may reconsider your fate." 2 warriors grabbed Jack's arms, hauling him forward. The others followed, their expressions a mix of curiosity and expectation. Jack inhaled slowly, steadying his heartbeat. He had just challenged a planet of warriors to something they had never accomplished. And now, there was no turning back. The path to the dragon pit was long and treacherous. Jagged cliffs loomed on either side, casting deep shadows over the cracked, blood-red ground. Jack walked at the center of the Draken warriors, their imposing figures flanking him like living walls of muscle and steel. They said nothing, but the smirks on their reptilian faces told him everything. They were waiting for him to realize his mistake, waiting for him to turn back. Jack kept his expression neutral, but his mind was racing. He had no weapons, no plan, just a reckless challenge thrown at a queen who now expected him to either prove himself or die trying. The air grew hotter the further they walked, thick with the scent of scorched earth. It wasn't just from the environment. Something ahead breathed that fire. As they crested a hill, the pit came into view. Jack felt the heat before he saw the beast. The Ravok was massive. It lay in the center of a circular stone arena, shackled by thick iron chains driven deep into the ground. Its scales shimmered like molten rock, shifting between deep crimson and obsidian black. Its claws, each as long as Jack's forearm, scraped against the floor as it twitched in irritation. The beast's eyes, twin pools of liquid fire, flickered open as the warriors approached. The Draken nearest to Jack smirked. "Still think you can tame it, human?" Jack ignored him, stepping forward. The heat from the dragon's body was suffocating, like standing too close to an open furnace. Every instinct in his body screamed at him to run, to get as far away from those glowing fangs as possible. But he didn't move. The Ravok inhaled sharply, nostrils flaring. It knew. It sensed him. The eyes of a predator locked onto him, and Jack felt the weight of that gaze settle on his soul. It wasn't just looking at him, it was judging him. The queen's voice rang out from above, where she stood on a raised stone platform overlooking the pit. "You may try, human, but if you fail, you will not leave this place alive." Jack glanced up at her, then back at the dragon. The Ravok's tail lashed against the ground, sending a tremor through the stone beneath his feet. Its wings twitched, their sheer size enough to cast shadows over the warriors standing at the edge of the pit. He took a slow step forward. The Ravok's head lifted slightly, watching. Another step. The chains groaned as the beast shifted, its massive body adjusting to his presence. The Draken warriors whispered among themselves, expecting Jack to be incinerated at any moment. Instead of fear, Jack felt something else creeping in: curiosity. The Ravok wasn't just raging against his findings, it was frustrated. The way its tail flicked, the way its nostrils flared, the way it tested its chains but never truly lunged. It wasn't blind rage, it was something else. Jack stopped just out of reach of its maw. The Ravok huffed, sending a burst of hot air washing over him. His skin prickled from the heat, sweat forming at his temples. He knew if he made the wrong move, this beast could kill him in seconds. He crouched slightly, lowering himself, not in submission, but in understanding. The Ravok's eyes narrowed. Jack moved slowly, reaching out his hand, palm open, fingers relaxed. He knew better than to show aggression. No sudden movements. No fear, just calm. The warriors above chuckled. The fool thinks he can reason with a beast. Jack ignored them. The Ravok's nostrils flared again, scenting the air, analyzing. Then, with a deep growl that rumbled like distant thunder, it lunged. Gasps rang out. Jack didn't flinch. The dragon stopped inches from him, its fangs bared, hot breath washing over his face. But it didn't bite. It didn't burn. It simply tested him. Jack locked eyes with the beast, unmoving. "Not what you expected, huh?" he muttered. The Ravok snorted, its massive chest rising and falling. Its gaze flickered to his outstretched hand, then back to his face. For the first time, the warriors watching above weren't laughing. Jack could feel it. This wasn't about dominance. This wasn't about strength. The Ravok wasn't some mindless monster. It was a creature of instinct, of pride, of something the Draken never understood: trust. Jack let his fingers graze the warm scales of the dragon's snout, and the Ravok let him. A hush fell over the arena. The Draken warriors, once jeering and confident in Jack's imminent death, now watched in stunned silence. No one had ever gotten this close to a Ravok without losing a limb or their life. And yet the massive beast merely stood there, nostrils flaring, flames flickering deep in its throat. Jack could feel the heat radiating from its body, the rough texture of its scales beneath his fingertips. The Ravok didn't strike. It didn't retreat either. Instead, it held its ground, waiting. Jack's pulse was steady now. He knew he was standing on the edge of something. Something fragile, something powerful. One wrong move could shatter it completely. He studied the creature, noting the way its body tensed in certain places, the way it favored one side, its left wing twitching slightly, almost involuntarily. A closer look revealed deep scars running along its limb. Old wounds. Jack frowned. It had been injured before, and not just from a fight. The scars were precise, deliberate, like the marks of restraints too tight for too long. He didn't know much about Ravoks, but he knew pain when he saw it. Carefully, he shifted his stance, lowering his hand from its snout and instead reaching toward its wing. The Ravok growled, a low warning. Its golden eyes flickered with something between aggression and hesitation. Jack paused but didn't pull away. "I'm not trying to hurt you," he murmured, voice steady. The Ravok's breathing deepened, another moment of hesitation. And then it did something no one expected. It lowered its wing. The gasp from the crowd was almost as loud as the Ravok's earlier roar. Draken warriors exchanged glances of disbelief. No one spoke. Even the queen, standing above the pit, narrowed her golden eyes in scrutiny. Jack pressed his palm against the beast's wing, feeling the deep ridges of old wounds. He could see now. This creature wasn't just tamed through force. It had been broken before, chained, controlled. The scars told a story the Draken either ignored or didn't care about. And now Jack understood why it hadn't attacked him immediately. He exhaled, his fingers tracing lightly over the damaged scales. "They did this to you, didn't they?" The Ravok rumbled lowly. Not a growl, not a snarl, something closer to understanding. Jack turned his head, looking up at the queen. Her expression remained unreadable, but Jack could feel the tension in the air. This wasn't how it was supposed to go. The Draken believed in strength through domination. But Jack wasn't dominating this creature. He was listening to it. He wasn't a master. He wasn't a ruler. He was something far more dangerous to the Draken way of life, an equal. The Ravok huffed, lowering its head slightly. Its giant amber eyes stared into Jack's, unblinking. Jack took a risk, a massive risk. He removed his hand from the beast's scales and took a step backward. If he had been wrong, if he had misread even a single movement, the Ravok could have torn him apart in an instant. But it didn't. It watched him, waiting. And then, in a single fluid motion, the Ravok stretched out its wings, both of them, fully unfurling for the first time in what seemed like years. Its chains rattled, but they didn't restrict its movement entirely. Jack could see it in the creature's stance, the way its tail flicked, the way its chest swelled with a long, deep breath. For the first time in a long time, the Ravok felt free. Above them, the queen's voice finally rang out, sharp as a blade. "Enough." Jack turned, and for the first time, he saw something on her face that hadn't been there before. Uncertainty. She had expected this human to fail, expected him to be torn apart, like all the others before him. But now, she was watching something unfold that had never happened in all of Draken history. Jack wasn't just surviving. He was changing the game. The queen descended the stone steps of the platform, her presence commanding as she approached the edge of the pit. Warriors moved aside as she stepped forward, her golden eyes flicking between Jack and the Ravok. The silence was heavy. The tension, thick. Then she spoke, voice measured, controlled. "This means nothing," she said. Jack smirked. "It means everything. And you know it." The Queen's jaw tensed slightly. The Ravok, still standing tall beside Jack, let out a deep rumbling exhale. The warriors no longer laughed. They no longer mocked. Instead, they watched. Because for the first time, they were seeing something they didn't understand. The wind shifted. The air inside the pit was thick with heat, but the silence that followed Jack's words carried a chill. The Draken warriors no longer whispered among themselves. They no longer smirked at the humans' impending demise. They were watching something unfold that none of them had seen before, something that should not have been possible. Jack Carter stood before the Ravok, a creature of pure destruction, a beast that had slaughtered warriors for centuries. And yet, it did not attack. It did not resist. It did not rage against its chains, desperate to break free. Instead, it stood beside him. The Queen's golden eyes flickered, her expression carefully neutral. But Jack wasn't fooled. He had been around enough powerful people to recognize when someone's confidence had cracked, even if just for a second. "This changes nothing," she repeated, but there was something different in her tone this time. Less certainty, more calculation. Jack let his hand rest against the Ravok's thick neck, feeling the heat pulsing beneath its scales. He could hear the slow rhythm of its breath, deep and steady. "That's where you're wrong," he said. "It changes everything." One of the warriors stepped forward, eyes blazing with frustration. He was taller than the others, broader, his deep violet scales catching the dim firelight. His armor was heavier, lined with jagged spikes. A warlord. "This is a trick," the warlord growled. "A game of chance. The beast has not accepted him. It simply tires of its chains. If you release it, it will tear him apart." Jack turned his gaze toward the Queen. "Then unchain it." A ripple of unease passed through the gathered warriors. No one had expected that. Some of them shifted uncomfortably, claws tightening around the hilts of their weapons. Others looked at their Queen, waiting for her response. She tilted her head slightly, considering him, measuring him. Jack met her gaze, unwavering. "You said it yourself. No one has ever tamed a Ravok. If you truly believe this means nothing, then prove it. Release the chains." The Queen said nothing. The warlord, however, snarled. "You are a fool, human. If we release it, you will die." Jack smirked. "Then what are you afraid of?" That did it. The warlord's nostrils flared, his grip tightening on his blade. But he did not step forward. He couldn't, not without proving Jack right. The Queen finally spoke, her voice carrying the weight of command. "Release it." The warriors stiffened. Some hesitated, but a command from the Queen was absolute. Two Draken moved forward, reaching for the massive iron locks binding the Ravok's limbs. The chains that had held it for years groaned as they were pulled loose, the heavy restraints crashing onto the stone floor one by one. Jack felt the change immediately. The Ravok shifted, its wings twitched, stretching for the first time in what had to be decades without restraint. Its muscles rippled, tail swiping once, testing its full range of motion. The warriors at the edge of the pit stepped back instinctively. Jack remained still. The last chain fell away. For a moment, nothing happened. Then, the Ravok moved. With a deep, guttural snarl, it flexed its massive wings, sending a powerful gust of wind through the arena. Dust and loose stones scattered. The warriors above raised their arms to shield their faces. And then, the Ravok turned toward Jack. The weight of its gaze was overwhelming, ancient, unforgiving. A force of nature, unshackled and unchained. Jack swallowed. This was the moment. The true test. If he had been wrong, if everything he thought he had understood about the creature had been a mistake, then he was about to die. The Ravok inhaled sharply. Its chest expanded. Heat rippled through the air, distorting the space between them. Jack could see the glow building in its throat, the embers of its fire flickering just behind its fangs. One breath. One choice. Jack took a slow step forward, not running, not challenging, just trusting. The Ravok exhaled. The burst of hot air ruffled Jack's clothes, sent his hair whipping around his face. But it was not fire. It was not death. It was acceptance. Jack slowly lifted his hand. The Ravok watched him, studied him, and then it lowered its head. Silence. Pure, absolute shock. Jack felt the moment settle into place like a final puzzle piece. A connection formed, unseen but undeniable. He let his fingers graze the smooth, warm scales between the beast's eyes. The Ravok rumbled deeply. Not a growl, not a warning, but something close to contentment. Above them, the Queen's expression remained carefully unreadable, but Jack knew what she was thinking. This had never happened before. One of the warriors whispered, voice barely audible, "By the gods." Jack smiled, patting the Ravok's snout. "Told you." The warriors no longer laughed. They no longer jeered. They only watched, eyes filled with something far more dangerous than disbelief. They were starting to believe. The celebration never came. Jack knew better than to expect one, but he still felt the weight of unspoken tension in the air. The Draken warriors had witnessed something impossible, something that had shattered their beliefs about strength, control, and dominance. And some of them hated him for it. As the Ravok stood beside him, fully unchained and still choosing not to incinerate him, the Queen's golden eyes remained unreadable. Her warriors, however, had begun to shift. Some looked uncertain, their rigid postures no longer carrying the same confidence they once did. Others looked furious. None more so than Warlord Kryn. Jack had noticed him before, standing near the Queen, his violet scales darker than the others, his jagged armor gleaming in the firelight. Kryn's eyes burned with something beyond anger, something dangerous. Jack had seen that kind of look before. He had made an enemy. The Queen stepped forward, voice measured, sharp as a blade. "You have done what no Draken has ever accomplished." A murmur rippled through the gathered warriors. Even those who still doubted couldn't deny what they had witnessed. Jack let his hand rest lightly against the Ravok's neck. So what now? For a long moment, the Queen simply watched him. Then she turned her back. "We will speak tomorrow." The words were simple, but Jack didn't miss the layers beneath them. The Queen was thinking, calculating what this meant for her rule, for her people, for him. She disappeared into the dark corridors of the fortress, leaving her warriors to stare at Jack and his new companion with a mixture of suspicion and awe. Jack exhaled slowly. The Ravok let out a deep, rumbling sound, a noise softer than its earlier roars, almost like a huff of amusement. Jack smirked. "Yeah, I think I just caused some problems." The night stretched long, the weight of his actions settling in. The Draken didn't immediately move against him, but Jack knew warriors like these. They wouldn't accept change easily, and some wouldn't accept it at all. When they led him away from the pit, he expected a cell, a locked room, maybe even an execution order. Instead, he was taken to a small stone chamber within the fortress, its walls carved with ancient symbols. A single fire burned in a corner, its embers flickering lazily. A place to rest. But Jack knew better than to let his guard down. He sat on the edge of the stone slab that passed for a bed, his mind replaying everything that had happened. The Ravok, his Ravok, was still in the pit, but now unchained, left to move freely for the first time in years. Would it stay? Would it wait for him? He didn't know. Jack rubbed his hands together, still feeling the warmth of the dragon's scales against his fingertips. He didn't get to think about it for long. Something shifted in the air. A presence. Jack didn't move. He didn't reach for a weapon. He didn't have one. But he didn't need one to know when someone was watching him. The door to his chamber was shut, but the shadows beyond it were different now. Thicker, darker. Jack slowly leaned back against the wall, forcing his breathing to remain even. If whoever was out there thought he was asleep, they'd get sloppy. And sure enough they did. The sound of metal sliding against leather, a blade being drawn, the faintest whisper of movement, a breath too sharp, the scrape of scales against stone. Then, the door creaked open. Jack didn't hesitate. He moved fast, kicking the stone water basin beside his bed straight into the intruder's legs. The figure stumbled, a Draken warrior, armor stripped down for silence, dagger glinting in the firelight. Jack was already moving. He grabbed the warrior's wrist before the dagger could slash toward him, twisting with all the strength he had. The warrior hissed in pain, but Jack knew Draken were stronger than humans. If this turned into a full fight, he wouldn't win on brute force alone. So he used momentum. He pulled the warrior forward while kicking out his knee. The Draken buckled, balance thrown off, and Jack drove his shoulder into his attacker's chest, slamming him against the wall. The dagger clattered to the ground. Jack grabbed it before the warrior could recover and pressed it against his throat. The Draken warrior bared his fangs, breathing hard. Jack's voice was low, steady. "Who sent you?" Silence. Jack applied a little more pressure. Not enough to cut, just enough to remind the warrior that he had lost. Then, the Draken spat a single name. Kryn. Jack wasn't surprised. He had known from the moment Kryn looked at him with hatred that the warlord wouldn't accept this public humiliation. The Draken were warriors, built on dominance and survival, and Kryn had just watched a human do the impossible in front of his entire people. Jack narrowed his eyes. "You came alone." The warrior sneered but didn't answer. Jack leaned in slightly, voice quiet but sharp. "If Kryn wants me dead, he should come himself." The warrior growled low in his throat, but Jack stepped back, flipping the dagger in his grip. Then, in a casual motion, he tossed it onto the floor at the warrior's feet. A test. A challenge. For a long moment, the Draken warrior simply stared at him. Then, slowly, he picked up the dagger, but he did not strike. Jack watched as his attacker backed toward the door. Golden eyes narrowed, muscles tense. The warrior hesitated just a second longer before disappearing into the corridor's shadows. Jack let out a slow breath. He wasn't safe here. Not yet. Kryn would not stop until he erased the insult Jack had carved into his pride. And if there was one thing Jack knew about men like him, it was this. They never attacked just once. Jack sat back on the stone slab, rolling his shoulders. His pulse was still steady, still controlled. Then, from outside the fortress, a deep, rumbling sound filled the night. Jack knew that sound. The Ravok. It had felt the threat. It had sensed his danger. Jack smirked to himself, stretching his arms behind his head as the distant warriors began shouting in alarm. He wasn't alone anymore. And Kryn had just made the biggest mistake of his life. The fortress was in chaos. Shouts echoed through the stone halls, heavy boots pounding against the ground as warriors scrambled toward the pit. Jack sat on the edge of his makeshift bed, listening to the rising panic outside. He already knew what they were seeing. The Ravok was free. Not just unchained, not just standing in the pit like some broken beast waiting for orders. Free. Awake. A force of nature reborn. Jack smirked to himself, rolling his shoulders. Kryn had planned on killing him in the dead of night, slipping a blade between his ribs before anyone could question it. But Kryn had forgotten one thing. Jack wasn't alone anymore. The Ravok had sensed the threat, and it had reacted. Jack pushed off the bed and strode toward the door. He had no weapon, no armor, but that had never stopped him before. He slipped into the corridor, staying close to the shadows. Draken warriors rushed past him, their focus locked on the sky outside. Some carried spears, others bolted toward the armory. He stepped onto the stone balcony overlooking the pit, and the sight below stole his breath. The Ravok stood at the center of the open courtyard, unbound and furious. Its massive wings stretched wide, nearly blotting out the torches lining the fortress walls. Its claws dug into the cracked stone, tail lashing violently as it let out another earth-shaking roar. And above them, the Vorak raiders had come. Jack hadn't expected an invasion tonight, but the timing couldn't have been worse, or, in a twisted way, better. The Vorak were sky raiders, a brutal species of winged mercenaries known for their ambush tactics. Their ships hovered above the fortress like black ghosts, sleek and silent. Too silent. They didn't use war horns or battle cries. They simply struck like knives in the dark. And now, they had chosen this night, the night Jack had flipped the Draken's world upside down. A perfect storm. A warrior rushed past Jack, barely sparing him a glance. The Draken had far bigger concerns now than the human they had wanted dead hours ago. Their fortress was under siege. Jack didn't hesitate. He vaulted over the stone railing, landing hard on the ground below. Dust kicked up around him as he straightened, locking eyes with the Ravok. The beast recognized him immediately. Its massive pupils locked onto his form, nostrils flaring, wings flexing. The Draken warriors stood back, unsure whether to fight the Ravok or the raiders above. Jack took a step forward. "You ready for a real fight, big guy?" The Ravok exhaled a low, deep growl. It wasn't anger. It wasn't hostility. It was understanding. Jack turned toward the gathered warriors, spotting the queen standing on the fortress steps. Her posture was rigid, her eyes flickering between him and the Ravok. Jack didn't wait for permission. He didn't need it. He sprinted forward and jumped onto the Ravok's back. Gasps erupted from the warriors. No one had ever attempted to ride a Ravok and lived. But Jack wasn't attempting, he was doing. The moment his hands grasped the thick, molten-colored scales, the beast moved. Its wings snapped downward, sending a shockwave of wind through the courtyard. Jack gritted his teeth as the force nearly threw him off, but he held on tight. The Ravok roared and launched itself into the sky. The fortress blurred beneath them as they ascended. The air turned sharp and thin, the stars stretching endlessly above them. Jack had never felt anything like it before. The raw, untamed power of the Ravok surged beneath him, every beat of its massive wings a testament to its strength. The Vorak raiders above had barely begun their descent before Jack and the Ravok were upon them. One of the Vorak ships turned, its cannons adjusting. Jack leaned forward, instinct guiding him. "Let's see what you can really do." The Ravok twisted midair, narrowly dodging the first blast. The ship fired again, but this time, the Ravok was faster. It dove, banking hard, then opened its jaws wide. Jack barely had time to brace before a torrent of fire erupted from its mouth. The Vorak ship exploded. Flames and metal rained from the sky, debris scattering in all directions. The other ships hesitated, their formation breaking as they recalculated. Jack grinned. "Yeah, that's what I thought." The Ravok let out another roar, its body thrumming with power. Below, the Draken warriors who had once doubted Jack now watched in stunned silence. He wasn't just the human who had tamed the Ravok. He was riding it into battle, and nothing would ever be the same again. The battlefield stretched across the night sky, lit by flames and explosions as the Vorak raiders scrambled to reorganize. They hadn't expected resistance like this. The Draken were formidable warriors on the ground, but against aerial invaders, they had always relied on siege weapons and defensive tactics. Until now, Jack and the Ravok were a storm. He gripped the rough scales tightly as the dragon twisted in the air, dodging another barrage of cannon fire. The Vorak ships were sleek, designed for speed, but the Ravok was faster, stronger, unrelenting. The Vorak pilots didn't understand what they were seeing. They had faced Draken warriors before, but this, a human riding an unchained Ravok into battle. This was something else entirely. Jack leaned forward. "All right, big guy, let's finish this." The Ravok let out a thunderous roar, flames crackling at the edges of its fangs. Then it dove. The air screamed past them as they plummeted toward the Lid Vorak ship. The pilot tried to maneuver away, But the Ravok's speed was unnatural, like a shadow cutting through fire. Jack timed it perfectly. The moment they got close, he gritted his teeth and jumped. For a split second, he was weightless, hurtling through the air toward the Vorak ship's deck. Then, impact. He rolled, absorbing the shock, boots slamming onto the metal surface. The Vorak crew barely had time to react before Jack was on them. The first pilot lunged, blade flashing, but Jack twisted, grabbing his wrist and flipping him over the railing. The second went for a rifle. Too slow. Jack ripped it from his hands and slammed the butt of it against his head, sending him crashing to the ground. Another Vorak aimed a blaster, but before he could fire, a massive shadow loomed overhead. The Ravok. Its wings blocked out the sky, its golden eyes burning with fury. Then, fire. A wave of molten heat roared down, engulfing the Vorak ship's engines. Alarms screamed. Metal ruptured. The ship tilted sharply, spiraling out of control. Jack didn't hesitate. He ran, sprinting toward the edge, then leaped. The Ravok was already there, waiting. His hands grasped the thick scales, and in one smooth motion, he pulled himself back onto the dragon's back as the Vorak ship exploded behind them. The remaining raiders fled. Their ships twisted away, disappearing into the night. They had no leader anymore, no strategy, no victory. They had come expecting an easy conquest. They had found something else instead. Jack exhaled, the adrenaline still burning in his veins. He reached down, patting the Ravok's side. Not bad, huh? The dragon rumbled in response, tilting its head slightly as if amused. Below them, the Draken warriors stood in the fortress courtyard, watching in stunned silence. The battle was over, and Jack had won. The Ravok descended, landing hard on the stone floor, its wings folding neatly against its back. Dust and embers still lingered in the air, swirling around them as the warriors hesitated. Jack swung a leg over, sliding off the dragon's back. The moment his boots hit the ground, the silence deepened. Then, the queen stepped forward. Her golden eyes were locked onto him, unreadable as always. But Jack could feel the shift. No mockery, no dismissal, just acknowledgement. She stopped a few feet away, studying him. When she finally spoke, her voice was softer than before. "You have changed what we believed." Jack didn't respond immediately. He just let the weight of those words settle in. Then, she lifted a single piece of armor from her belt. A warrior's crest, a mark of honor among the Draken. She offered it to him. The warriors around them shifted, some exchanging uneasy glances. This was not a small gesture. Jack reached out, taking the crest in his hand. He rolled it between his fingers, feeling the cool weight of it. A smirk tugged at the corner of his lips. "Guess that means I'm one of you now." The queen held his gaze. "It means you are something new." A deep rumble sounded behind him. Jack turned to see the Ravok lifting its head, golden eyes narrowing at the distant sky. It let out a slow, low growl, a warning. Jack exhaled. Something's coming. The queen didn't look surprised. It always is. Jack ran a hand through his hair, glancing at the warriors still watching him in stunned silence. He chuckled to himself. "Guess I better stick around then."